Welcome to Counterspin, your weekly look behind the headlines. I'm Janine Jackson. This week on Counterspin, what do we want? Multiracial democracy. When do we want it? Now. What stands in the way? White supremacy that has disregarded, derailed, and violently defied that democracy at multiple important turns. Those anguished over the Rittenhouse acquittal, depressed by racist police brutality, unnerved by the failure to take the January 6th insurrection seriously, and worried about systemic predations on voting rights, are sometimes led to say, "This isn't America." If you attend to actual U.S. history, importantly different from what you might have read in your history textbook, or what you might someday be allowed to read in your history textbook, you will understand that this is America. But that still doesn't mean that it has to be. This can be a turning point in U.S. history if we don't sit down and shut up, and if more of us understand that history isn't something that happens to us or around us, but something we do. Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University and the author of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, and One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. We'll talk with her about her recent Guardian column on the historical and ongoing struggle between white supremacy and the U.S.'s hopes for democracy. That's coming up, but first we'll take a quick look back at some recent press. When a news outlet hosts a roundtable on affirmative action featuring only white men, or a debate on abortion, including only people who won't become pregnant, the bias is pretty clear. But many of corporate media's ways of telling you to think one thing but not another are more subtle and insinuating, and especially effective if they're talking about a place you don't know much about. On November 19th, farmers in India and their global supporters celebrated the announcement by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi of the repeal of 3 agricultural laws that farmers and allies have been protesting vehemently and at great cost for more than a year. Some 250 million people took to the streets across India last December against policies of Modi's right-wing Hindu nationalist government, and 3 laws in particular that deregulated the agricultural sector. The government said the laws aim to give farmers, quote, the freedom to sell directly to institutional buyers, close quote, unshackling them, they said, to get better prices. But opposition parties and others called out that the new rules would make small farmers vulnerable to competition from big business, result in their losing price support on key staples, and generally diminish farmers' bargaining power. India's agricultural sector sustains some 58% of the country's people, and farmers found many allies in their resistance. But that didn't mean that the months of action didn't take a tremendous toll, including as many as 750 protesters who died in harsh protest camp conditions. Which brings us to the New York Times reporting on the repeal of the laws under protest. Quote, in rare show of weakness, Modi bows to India's farmers, close quote, was the paper's November 20th headline. FAIR's Julie Haller suggested on Twitter that when a nominally Democratic government addresses widespread and sustained public demands, some folks would call that something positive, like responsiveness, rather than weakness. Reporters don't write headlines, as we often note, but this piece delivered multiple linguistic tells. COVID and the struggling economy left Modi's party, quote, vulnerable to a well-organized protest movement, close quote, the subhead explained. So don't focus on the wrongness of the laws, but other externals as crucial. And then for those who know elite media, well-organized is a bit of a wink toward the idea that an honest protest would consist of atomized individuals. Organization is a bit suspicious. The laws Modi says will be repealed, we're told early on, were, quote, aimed at fixing the country's struggling agricultural sector, close quote. Well, who doesn't want to fix something that's struggling? There is a single paragraph tucked in about how one of the governing party's convoys rammed into a group of protesting farmers, resulting in the deaths of, that's media speak for killing, 4 of them, along with 4 others, including a journalist. And then late in the piece, an academic source suggests that the success of protests is good news for India's democracy. It isn't that you can't learn, in this case about Indian farmers' protests, from reading a story like this. It's just always worth considering whether you're taking away something more than information. You're listening to Counterspin, brought to you each week by the Media Watch Group FAIR. Those sifting for signs of critical weakness in the prosecution argument in the Kyle Rittenhouse trial are missing the forest for the trees. We ask the law to deliver us from injustice, but remember why people were protesting in Kenosha, Wisconsin in the first place, to protest the inadequacy of U.S. systems and institutions to protect or to value Black life. The head-spinning outrage of this case, from police thanking Rittenhouse for roaming around with an illegal assault rifle, up through his acquittal of the murders he committed, may make it seem that what we used to quaintly call race relations have gone to a whole other level. But it's important to remember that the roots of these events, along with other things we see happening, are entwined deeply throughout this country's history. And as our guest's work reminds us, we aren't just talking about the relationship between Black and white Americans. We're talking about the relationship between Americans and democracy. Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University and the author of White Rage, The Unspoken Truth of Our Racial Divide, and One Person, No Vote, How Voter Suppression is Destroying Our Democracy. She joins us now by phone from Atlanta. Welcome back to Counterspin, Carol Anderson.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, I've been hearing the term turning point. And I want to believe it, but if we are to be at a turning point, seeing where we've been can show us what we need to do and what will be insufficient. And that's why I wanted to talk about your most recent piece for The Guardian, whose headline really encapsulates the lesson: white supremacists declare war on democracy and walk away unscathed. You're talking, yes, about the January 6th insurrection and the response to that, but you talk about it as an echo of actions and responses going really all the way back to the beginning of the country.
Absolutely. And what struck me, and this really began to come out for me as I was working on my latest book, the second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America,
Oh boy.
was the way that white supremacists were willing to hold the United States of America hostage in order to advance their white supremacist ideology, in order to embed it into the bedrock foundation of this nation, and that they were willing to destroy the United States if they didn't get their way. And for that, they should have been held accountable. But instead, they were revered. Instead, they were allowed to walk away. And that lack of accountability over and over and over only emboldens the white supremacists and puts the United States of America and its ideas and this democracy at risk.
Well, you talk about how even during the War of Independence, we're talking about South Carolina. Take us back to that, because I don't believe that I think people think, yes, I remember the Civil War, but it goes before that.
It goes before that. And so you had the British who said that they were going to hit the soft underbelly of the revolution, which was the South. And the British hit Georgia and just took Savannah, boom, like that. And then they were headed up to South Carolina. And George Washington sent his emissary, his aide-de-camp, down to South Carolina to plead with the government there to arm the enslaved, because South Carolina did not have enough white men to take on that 8,000-strong British force that was coming for the invasion. And South Carolina looked at John Lawrence, and John Lawrence is a son of the South. He is a South Carolinian. And they looked at him, and they were outraged. They talked about how horrified they were. They were absolutely alarmed that he would even suggest this, that this would be coming from Washington. This would be coming from the Continental Congress to try to arm the enslaved just because the British were invading. No way, because the whites had deployed white men to act as the militia to control that enslaved population that the government had defined as the threat. So this is in the middle of a war, and the threat are black people. They began to talk about surrendering to the British, and trying to declare their neutrality in this war, just so they would not have to arm the enslaved. And so think about that. They were willing to walk away from the United States of America, the thing that folks have been fighting for, the thing that folks have been dying for, just so that they could continue to enslave human beings, enslave black people.
And so it's very meaningful then that after that fact, there was no kind of comeuppance. There was no kind of, you didn't have our back there. You weren't really with us. There was no kind of assessment or real consequences for South Carolina.
No consequences. There was some grumbling, and they didn't even fight. But the thing is that they were fully welcomed into the halls of power. They were fully welcomed into the Constitutional Convention, where, again, they flexed their Southern muscles to demand that the bedrock document for the United States of America, the Constitution, would have embedded in it inordinate power for slaveholders, for the enslavers, and that it would continue to protect slavery. And they kept making clear, we will walk away unless we get what we want. And so you had folks like James Madison, who was the architect of the Constitution, and Rufus King out of Massachusetts, who were beside themselves going, we had to give in because the United States of America was worth it. They were willing to destroy the United States of America unless they got their way. And so their way included 20 additional years of the Atlantic slave trade. It included the Fugitive Slave Clause, and it included the 3/5 clause that added additional congressional representation to the southern states in Congress by counting their enslaved people as 3/5 for population numbers. And it was that 3/5 clause that added an additional 18 to 20 seats to the South in Congress, where they then flexed their muscle again. And for all of that, no consequences.
Can you just take a note about the beating up? We're not talking about just haranguing. We're, what they did to get their way, it would blow minds today.
Yeah, Joanne Freeman wrote a brilliant book, Field of Blood, where she lays out how the South bullied and beat on Northern congressional representatives to ensure that language and bills that would try to curtail slavery did not see the light of day. So this led up to with the caning actually of Charles Sumner, where he was beaten on the Senate floor by Preston Brooks out of South Carolina. No consequences.
Right.
And what this does is white supremacy keeps bullying, keeps beating, keeps threatening the viability of the United States of America. White supremacy cannot be satisfied, cannot be sated. There's not enough that you can give it to make it go, okay, I'm fine, we're cool.
Right.
Instead, without having consequences for that horrific behavior, it only emboldens. And this is what leads us into the Civil War.
Absolutely. And so I hope that listeners know about the Civil War and the Confederacy, but let's skip, if we would, to the way they were treated. Again, we're talking about repercussions for aggression. We have folks who are so emboldened that they're declaring war on the United States. Then when they lose, again, they get folded back in, right?
Oh. I mean, so imagine killing over 600,000 American troops, costing the U.S. billions of dollars, trying to get the British and the French to hop into the war to fight against the United States of America. And after the South loses the war, then you have Andrew Johnson as president granting amnesty to the Confederate leaders. And then, because the whole point for Johnson was that this was a war to keep the Union together. And so you don't have the consequences for those who waged war against the United States of America. These are traitors. And instead what happens is that you get not only this folding in of these traitors into the United States of America, but you get then this narrative that comes through in the textbooks, this lost cause, that this war was about Southern heritage, and it was about states' rights. It wasn't about slavery, and that this was the war of Northern aggression, when it was the South that fired on Fort Sumter because Lincoln had won the election, and his platform was that he did not want to see slavery extended out west. Not that he wanted to abolish slavery, but that he didn't want to have it extended out west. And that's what I mean about white supremacy cannot be sated. White supremacy cannot be sated, and particularly if it does not have to face the consequences of the damage that it does to this nation, to American democracy.
Well, the importance of that narrative being allowed to continue and to grow can't be understated. But I also wanted to note how you point out that folding those Confederates back into the U.S., that was also helped by the Supreme Court undoing decisions that Congress had made, and we're still living with that as well.
Absolutely. So Congress had put in place, the Reconstruction Congress had put in place basically the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. 13th, abolishing slavery. The 14th, providing for birthright citizenship, due process, and equal protection under the law. And the 15th, providing that no state shall abridge the right to vote on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Congress also passed acts to ban white domestic terrorism because of the rise of the Klan and the violence that the Klan and its ilk, such as the White Camellia, the Knights of the White Camellia, and the Red Shirts, were raining down on black folk. And so Congress had tried to provide those protections. And you had the U.S. Supreme Court going through in decision after decision and undermining every one of those protections. And what that did was it allowed the rise of that white supremacist regime to go on unchecked and rain down its violence and its discriminatory actions that, again, undermined American democracy. This is where we get the rise of Jim Crow, and this is where we get the rise of lynching.
And it shows that the intertwining of law and this vigilantism, I mean, it's not just the narrative of the lost cause and the war of Northern aggression that's been allowed to go unchecked, but we also have these laws, that tell people that somehow the law has their back, and that brings us back to January 6th at the U.S. Capitol, where people are believing that they are supporting something, believing that they are also continuing some historical thrust. And they have reason to believe that. Yeah. And then also the consequences here. Again, folks may say, this is so surprising. This is an echo of what's happened before.
This is an echo of what happened before, because what this was about at its base was the demonization of voters of color. So you had the Republicans laying out that the election was stolen from Trump in Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Detroit, cities where you have sizable black populations. And so when they say, if you only count the legal votes, he won, which meant if you don't count the votes from black folk in the city, he won. And it is that anger that black folks and Asian Americans and Native Americans and Hispanics did not overwhelmingly vote for an avowed white supremacist, that you get this attack on the U.S. Capitol, on American democracy, as Congress is doing its work of certifying the election by counting the electoral votes. And where they're hanged Mike Pence, and they're hunting for Nancy Pelosi. As one of the assailants said, they wanted to drag her where her head was hitting every one of the steps coming down out of that Capitol. They saw themselves as patriots, but what they were doing was assaulting American democracy for white supremacy. That should have been stunning enough. But instead, what we get is the January 6th Commission taking months upon months to come into being. And then it's subpoenas being like, who cares about a subpoena?
Right.
Where you're getting the assailants who went into the Capitol, who defecated in there, beat on police officers. We've got the first real sentence of 41 months. But generally you were getting probation, you can go on vacation. Wow. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. When you don't have consequences for assaulting American democracy, it empowers and it emboldens white supremacy to assault and attack it again.
Well, we think of history as moving. Many people think of history as moving, if not smoothly, still directionally, like we're still sort of stepping towards equality among races with a few steps back. But part of that narrative is you don't fight for equality. Equality is about everybody getting along, and so black people being angry is part of the problem. There's this narrative confusion about what it takes to make history, and that somehow history is going to happen even if I don't do anything.
And as Frederick Douglass says, power never concedes anything without a demand. It never has, and it never will. To me, the story of America is that we are an aspirational nation. We hold these truths to be self-evident. That's the aspiration. And you have those who confuse that aspiration with achievement, like we have overcome, when in fact it has been black folk who have been fighting to make that aspiration real. It has been those who have been marginalized in this society, those who have faced the brunt of the worst that white supremacy has to offer, and who believed in America enough to fight for it, not fight against it, but to fight for it.
I've been thinking of this Raymond Williams quote, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." I find it difficult to grapple with right now, but in your work, you talk about imagining. You talk about what if Reconstruction had actually honored the citizenship of 4 million freed people? What if Brown versus Board of Education were really honored? Being able to imagine, to envision, that's the way to get to hope. That's the only way, isn't it?
Yes, because it is in that imagining that you know what you're fighting for, that you don't look around you and say, well, this is the way it is, and so it's not going to get any better. It is in that imagining. I think about the enslaved. They had to imagine what freedom looked like. Wow. Imagine hundreds of years of being enslaved, and you imagine freedom, and that freedom is a possibility for you and your family, for those who look like you. That's powerful. It is those who came under Jim Crow who imagined what a system looked like that did not have Jim Crow as its operating principle. We have to have that power of imagination now. It looks really, really bad. But when we imagine what our future could be and what our present could be, and we organize and we mobilize, we vote for that future. Wow. Wow.
Carol Anderson is the Charles Howard Candler Professor of African American Studies at Emory University. You can find her important article, White Supremacists Declare War on Democracy and Walk Away Unscathed, on theguardian.com. Thank you so much for joining us this week, Carol Anderson.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
And that's it for Counterspin for this week. Counterspin is produced by FAIR, the National Media Watch group based in New York. If you missed part of today's show or you'd like to hear previous shows, you can find shows and transcripts on our website, fair.org. The website is also the place to sign up for FAIR's Action Alert Network or to subscribe to our newsletter, Extra. The show is engineered by Alex Noyes. I'm Janine Jackson. Thank you for listening to Counterspin.